8 Navy helicopters crossed the Iranian coast on the night of April 24, 1980, and not one of them turned back. For 172 days, the United States had watched its diplomats held captive in Tehran, and every answer it tried had failed. The embassy had fallen on November 4, 1979, when student followers of Ayatollah Khomeini stormed the compound and seized its staff. 13 captives were freed that month, 53 Americans remained, and the diplomatic channels had gone cold. Operation Eagle Claw was the last instrument left, 8 RH-53D helicopters off the deck of the USS Nimitz, a fleet of C-130s, and Colonel Charlie Beckwith's Delta Force waiting in the dark. In this alternate timeline exploration, we examine what could have happened and why the real history unfolded differently. The mission lived or died on a single number. The planners needed 6 working helicopters at the desert strip code named Desert 1. Anything fewer, and Beckwith would have to abort. That night, the formation flew straight into the path of a haboob, a wall of suspended dust that swallowed the horizon. In the timeline we know, it broke the mission. Instruments failed, a hydraulic system gave out, and only 5 helicopters arrived intact. But here the corridor held. The aircraft that lost its hydraulics in reality held its pressure. The pilots threaded the clear air along the storm's edge, and when they touched down at Desert 1, 6 were operational and ready. The C-130s pumped fuel into their tanks. Before midnight, the force lifted off again toward the hide site near Tehran. What no one at Desert 1 could yet measure was the price the next 12 hours would demand and how far its echo would travel. The assault force spent the daylight hours hidden in the hills southeast of Tehran, motionless under camouflage netting while the city went about its business below. After dark, a small advance team brought up trucks and vans that had been quietly gathered inside Iran for weeks. The Delta operators climbed aboard and rode into the capital in ordinary traffic, past checkpoints that did not look twice at another set of headlights. At the embassy wall, the operation turned sudden and violent. Delta breached the compound and moved building to building, overcoming the student guards in a fight that was sharp and brief. There were casualties among the captors and among the Americans as well. A second, smaller element moved on the foreign ministry, where 3 more diplomats had been held apart from the rest. Within the hour, the hostages were collected and counted. The helicopters came in over the rooftops to the agreed signal. They lifted the assault force and the freed Americans out of the city and ran south to Manzaria, a disused airfield that a ranger company had already seized and secured. There, Air Force transports waited with engines turning. As the first gray light touched the desert, the aircraft climbed out of Iranian airspace and turned west. The hostages were gone. The crisis, after 5 months, was over, though its meaning had only begun. Jimmy Carter went on television in the early hours of April 25, 1980, and the country woke to a different morning. He spoke carefully, without celebration, naming the 8 months of patience that had preceded the raid and the servicemen who had not come home. But the fact beneath the words was unmistakable. The Americans were free. The former hostages passed first through a U.S. military hospital in Wiesbaden, West Germany, where doctors examined them and families waited. Then they came home. Crowds lined the routes from the airfields. Yellow ribbons that had marked a vigil now marked a homecoming. A nation that had spent the winter feeling powerless watched the helplessness drain away almost overnight. Carter did not pretend the cost had been nothing. Cyrus Vance, who had opposed the rescue from the start, left the State Department within weeks, a departure he had decided on regardless of the outcome. The mood of the country, though, had shifted on its axis. For a year, the hostage crisis had been the daily measure of American decline. Now it was a victory, and a victory in an election year does not stay in the realm of foreign policy for long. Inside Iran, the raid landed as a wound, and the Islamic Republic moved quickly to decide what kind of wound it would be. The hostages had been the regime's leverage and its proof of defiance. Now they were gone, lifted out in a single night by the very power Khomeini had branded the Great Satan. A defeat told plainly would have been dangerous to the revolution's authority. So it was not told plainly. The clerical leadership recast the operation as naked foreign aggression, an invasion of Iranian soil, an assault to be avenged rather than a loss to be mourned. State media spoke of martyrs and violation, not of captives slipping through the regime's fingers. Beneath that public account, a quieter and harsher process began. If American aircraft had reached Tehran and a hidden network had supplied their vehicles, then there were collaborators, and collaborators had to be found. The hunt deepened the suspicion already running through the new state. It also sharpened the conflict between President Abul Hassan Banisadr, who held office without controlling the forces around him, and the hardliners who increasingly did. The revolution had survived the raid, but it had been forced to look inward, and what it saw there, it did not trust. The consequences of that turn would prove lasting. But first, the story moves back across the Atlantic to an election that had just changed shape. Senator Edward Kennedy had built his primary challenge on the argument that Carter was a weak president presiding over a drifting country. For months, that argument had found an audience. The malaise framing, drawn from Carter's own 1979 address on a crisis of confidence, had hung over the administration like a verdict. The rescue cut the ground from under it. An incumbent who had just brought 52 Americans home from captivity was no longer an easy symbol of national paralysis. Kennedy's late spring primaries, already an uphill fight, lost their rationale. Voters who had been registering frustration with Carter now had something else to weigh. By the time the Democratic National Convention opened in New York that August, the contest was effectively settled. The convention that in the real timeline had been tense and divided, with Kennedy withholding a full embrace of the nominee, instead closed ranks. Carter accepted the nomination as a sitting president with a concrete success behind him, not as a wounded one defending his record. The party that had spent a year arguing about its own leader stopped arguing. The general election, though, would not be decided on foreign ground. Ronald Reagan had organized much of his campaign around a single idea, that America had grown weak and that its weakness was visible everywhere from Afghanistan to the embassy in Tehran. The hostages were Exhibit A. When they came home in April, that exhibit disappeared. Reagan was too disciplined a candidate to keep swinging at an argument that no longer connected. He shifted his attack to the ground where Carter remained genuinely vulnerable, and that ground was real. Inflation was still punishing. Gas prices and unemployment still shaped how families judged the year. Reagan pressed the economy relentlessly, and on the economy he was not wrong. Carter, for his part, ran as a steady commander-in-chief, a president who had chosen a hard course and seen it through. The campaign became a contest between two true things: a country that felt safer and a country that still could not afford its groceries. The wide lead Reagan had once seemed to hold narrowed through the autumn. This was not the landslide the real 1980 produced. It was a close race, and a close race can turn on the calendar. And the calendar that year held one more coincidence. Election Day fell on November 4th, 1980, exactly 1 year to the day since the students had climbed the embassy walls in Tehran. The anniversary was inescapable. Every voter who walked into a polling place did so on the date that had once meant humiliation and now meant something closer to deliverance. The result was not a verdict on a single man's strength. It was a genuine contest, decided state by state, between economic anger and the memory of a rescue. In states where inflation and lost jobs governed the mood, Reagan ran strong, and in several of them he won. But enough states where the economic pain was real found it offset by a sense that the country had recovered its footing, that the president had earned a second look. Jimmy Carter won a narrow second term. There was no sweeping mandate in it, no reordering of the political map. He carried the states he needed and lost the ones he could not save, and the margin stayed thin into the night. A presidency that, in the timeline we know, ended on its single term instead continued. What came next would test whether one good night in the desert could carry 4 more years. It could not. A second Carter term inherited every problem the rescue had not touched, and those problems were the larger share. Inflation did not yield to a homecoming. The Iran-Iraq War, opened by Saddam Hussein's invasion in September 1980, dragged on across a region where American influence was still thin. The Cold War remained cold and dangerous, Soviet troops still occupied Afghanistan, and the structural strains in the economy answered to interest rates and oil markets, not to applause. The lesson of this timeline is a quiet one. A single decisive success can change who holds power. It cannot change the conditions that power must govern. Carter, the wartime victor, still faced the same arithmetic that had troubled Carter, the embattled incumbent. The conservative movement, meanwhile, did not vanish. It regrouped. Denied the presidency in 1980, it began the longer argument over who should carry its banner into 1984, and whether Reagan, now 4 years older, his great theme spent, was still the man to do it. The revolution that real history delivered that November was not cancelled here. It was deferred. And history rarely lets a deferred thing arrive unchanged.